Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Advanced Placement European History. We'll be using the McKay, Hill, and Buckler text et al., 7th edition, and welcome to Chapter 12, Sections 1 and 2, The Crisis of the Later Middle Ages. Important questions to consider while you are reading the text for this chapter. What economic difficulties was Europe experiencing as they entered the 14th century? How did they deal with these difficulties, and how did that lead to the devastating consequences of the Black Death? Question 2, what were the social and psychological effects of repeated attacks of the plague and the disease? One thing that we'll start to discover in the text is the interconnectedness of all of the economic, social, and cultural outcomes that occur with each event, whether it be war, which we'll be discussing later, or whether it be an epidemic such as the plague. Part 1, Prelude to Disaster, offers many different things that were going on in the early 14th century that are going to set up the plague to be even more devastating than it was. There was considerable price inflation, and what that is a part of is overpopulation, which is further on down the list. Severe weather led to poor farming, and that led to the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322. And we also find that there's a major ineptitude in the government institutions to deal with disasters, to deal with famine, to deal with economics, and that will continue and carry on into the plague and expose the government structures and the structure and institution of the church. Consequences of the events that happened on the previous slide. The first is really instrumental in setting up the devastation of the plague. Lack of food, reduced caloric intake causes malnutrition and increases susceptibility to disease. Famine led to the abandonment of homesteads. We see an increase overall throughout Europe of homelessness, what we would today call homelessness, and also a loss of property by many poor people who had to sell because they had no income coming in, and allowed wealthier people to maintain larger land rights. This, as I mentioned before, also led to the exposure of government and its ineffective dealings with catastrophe. We find that many people practically postponed marriage, and we see a rise in anti-Semitism. And this is a scapegoat, as it will be all throughout history. You'll see a common occurring theme. Most people think that anti-Semitism is related directly to the Holocaust and World War II, but there are varying degrees of scapegoating carried out against Jewish people throughout the centuries leading up to World War II in Europe. The Black Death itself, how does it spread? What happens that causes this increased spread of disease? And speaking of that interconnectedness, 3-mast ships, the development of technology. People could now sail year-round, and one consequence that they didn't realize because of this was that now rats that carried diseases also spread year-round throughout the globe, and much more rapidly. And to most of us, it would seem to be inconsequential, but rats, and as we'll get to on the next slide, fleas and other vermin were a common part of daily life for people in Europe and everywhere for that matter in the 14th century. In October of 1347, Genoese ships brought the plague to Italy. And from there it crept along seaports and eventually worked its way through the mainland of Europe. The map that you're viewing right now shows a little bit of that spread. And what we notice, as your text mentions, it starts in Messina, which you can see in purple at the southern end of Italy, on the island of Sicily. And we see Sardinia and Marseille, Constantinople, and we see the color degree varying as you move inland. It took several years for it to get inland, but we see how the plague was kind of traced through this visual representation. How did the disease spread? As I mentioned, the disease lived in the bloodstream of rodents, and it was spread to humans by fleas, which transferred the infected blood. Your book mentions two types of the plague, bubonic and pneumonic. Pneumonic being that was spread by being in close proximity with other people. Bubonic meaning that which was directly flowing into the bloodstream by these bites of fleas. The disease that started as a boil in the armpit, groin, or neck, and secondary stages would include black spots caused by bleeding under the skin. People believed it was spread by something in the air, just by dirty air, basically. Physicians could ease the pain, but there was very little help otherwise, and this also exposed the ineptitude of medicine at the time. From a high point in the classic civilizations of Greece and Rome to kind of a lull during the Middle Ages. Consequences of the plague, and that's going to be an important theme throughout your textbook, is not only what were these major events, when did they occur, but how did they affect people. And your book talks about social, economic, and political changes, psychological changes, and we see many key points that are made in this section of the text in chapter 12. Overall, a big change was in the church. The clergy showed bravery during the plague, despite much criticism and how they had handled wealth up to this point. Overall, it seems that the people who stayed, the people who cared for and nursed those that were dying, were clergy. As a result, there was a high mortality rate among the clergy, and this will spill over into chapter 14 for us because due to that high mortality rate, less competent people were left in charge and much more susceptible to misappropriating church funds and not being able to deal with the general population quite as competently. Other things that paved the way for being questioned by the church and by its attendees in the future were some of the rules that the clergy broke just to survive during the Black Death. Many laymen and women were issued, meaning those that weren't ordained priests, to administer the sacrament and hear confession. And what this did is it gave an autonomy to the people that they had not experienced up to this point. Economically, one might be surprised to learn that most records show a relatively smooth resilience in economies after the plague. Within about 25 years, by about 1375, most landlords had recovered. Overpopulation that had been partially cause for some of the difficulties in the early 14th century had been balanced out by the plague, and it gave opportunities to people that may have not otherwise had them. Many new men, as your text quotes, were given opportunities. Most of the time, clergy and people who belonged to guilds, merchant guilds, craftsmen's guilds, were people that were related to those people already in the profession. And because of the mortality rate, many new opportunities were given to people outside of that sphere prior to the plague. And despite a rise in inflation due to the fall in production and shortage of goods, many people enjoyed a higher standard of living. But also on the downside, slavery increased. Slavery made many, many people wealthy because of the labor shortages. This picture, Dance of Death, kind of depicts some of the psychological and cultural effects that the Black Death brought about. One would not be surprised to learn that the Black Death created a pessimism throughout the European community about death and about hopelessness, because there was really nothing that they could do about it. And this, along with many of the other pieces of art and literature from the time, depicts those that are already dead leading off those that are living. And finally, consequences of the plague, cultural and psychological, some of which I just mentioned, that were depicted in the art that you just saw. Profound pessimism, religious fervor, the assumption that God was punishing people for their wicked ways, brought along what is mentioned in your text as the flagellants, okay, or otherwise known as flagellantism, which was whipping or flogging oneself, punishing oneself physically as a penance for sins. Something very morbid and self-inflicted. Along with that, funerals became small and hasty. Prior to this time, in the 13th century, funerals were a fairly big event. And because of the scare of death and catching the disease, most times they were cold and harsh. The idea of quarantine, or the word quarantine, which actually was derived because people were afraid to let travelers into their cities. So they would make them stay on vessels, on ships, for approximately a month to make sure that there was no Black Death that they were bringing into new towns. And what this did is it further closed off communities and isolated them and made them even more homogeneous from the contrast earlier over the excitement of exploration and travel and the exchange of goods and ideas. A positive, many new educational institutions came about, primarily for the reason that the population had been devastated, and those that had positions in the community that required education had been depleted to the point that they needed a vast move toward educating new people, much like the allowance of many new people into the guilds. And as you saw in the previous slide, also morbid literature and art, establishing an overall black cloud, if you will, over Europe at the time. So as you can see, many consequences besides just the death of approximately 1/3 of the European population. Social, economic, cultural consequences that will play a role in the rest of the 14th century and move us into the problems that the church is going to have very soon. Thank you for listening. That is sections 1 and 2 of chapter 12.